Hello everyone. Welcome to HNN Audio Story. Today, I will tell you a story about haunted. Are you ready? I'll begin right now. Chapter 1. My uncle passed away. In 2003, when I was in 6th grade, news came from my maternal hometown that my uncle had passed away. He died of liver cancer. I remember that when he was alive, he drank a lot of alcohol. Perhaps it was due to the after effects of alcohol. I rarely saw him because the distance was too far. Every year, I only got to visit my maternal hometown once or twice. Every time I went, I saw him drink a huge glass of alcohol while eating. At that time, I was still very good. I tried drinking and found it too spicy. So I cried. I don't know why I was so big then, but I still cried. My paternal uncle had to coax me to stop. If I drank alcohol now, someone would probably cry with me. That year at home, I was about to have summer vacation when I heard that my uncle had passed away. My father, my mother, and my grandmother all went back to my hometown. At that time, only my father, my eldest uncle, my grandmother, and I went. At that time, I was still young and didn't feel too sad. I was just excited because I was about to go back to my hometown and sit in a car to see the scenery. My hometown is in Thanh Thuy, Phu though. If I remember correctly, it was more than 100 kilometers from my house. I had to sit in a car for 4 hours and had to go 2 stages. The first stage was from me to Hanoi. Then the second stage from Hanoi. I started taking the Tu Vu bus straight to my hometown. I remember when I was little, my mother and I often took the wrong bus to Son Tay when we went to my hometown. From there, we crossed the Da River to my hometown, so we had to take another ferry to get to my hometown. When we got there, my mother was constantly scolded by my uncles because she had lived there since she was little and still didn't know the way. I was so far away, but I didn't feel sleepy at all. While my father and uncle were snoring loudly, only my grandmother sat there sobbing, probably because she felt sorry for my uncle. He died so young. That year he was only 42. When we got there, it was past 12 o'clock. There were only a few people cleaning up the house. As soon as my grandmother arrived, she cried and ran to my grandmother's coffin and lay there. Everyone was afraid that she would faint from crying, so they tried to drag her out. But she kept struggling, so the whole family stopped. My uncle left too early, leaving my aunt alone with her 2 small children. Everyone felt sorry for the 3 of them. My aunt quickly brought out a tray of food for my father and I to eat to ease our hunger. But I wasn't hungry and couldn't swallow the cold offering rice, so I went to the back of the house to play. My uncle's house was a normal tiled house. Behind it was a hill. It was not very high and gently sloping. It looked very beautiful. At that time in my hometown, every family grew cassava. The families that grew little only planted around the garden, but the families that grew a lot planted on the hill. Some families also got rich because of cassava. I remember when I was little, we often went up there to play hide and seek with the children around there. Then jokingly broke the rows of cassava. My uncle always scolded me. I groped my way up, partly because I wanted to see what it was like, and partly because I wanted to pee. After sitting in the car for hours, I was so angry that I had to go a short distance. I saw a man wearing black pants, a white shirt, and a pith helmet standing with his back to me. I thought that every father would come up here to pee, so I didn't care. But strangely, when I finished peeing and looked up, I still saw him standing with his back to the bushes, not knowing what he was doing. I thought it was strange, so I called out, "Uncle, what are you doing?" I called him 2 or 3 times, but he didn't answer. So I was curious, so I ran up to see what he was looking at so intently. But strangely, he was only about 4 or 5 meters away from me, but no matter how far I walked, I still felt like I was quite far from him. The hill was sloping, so after climbing a bit I was out of breath. I was so tired, so I went down, thinking to myself that maybe some drunk guy had peed and fallen asleep up there. When I got close to the place I looked up again, but this time I didn't see anyone standing in that bush. At that time I just thought he had gone somewhere again, so I went into the house without paying any more attention. At night, because it was in the countryside and near the mountains, my aunt's house was very quiet, partly because it was located deep inside the main road. My father, Uncle Dai and I decided to sleep here because we were worried that my aunt would be afraid to sleep alone. Actually, my cousin Kwong, he called my aunt his aunt and sister-in-law, lived there. But their house was at the end, and his wife was pregnant, so he had to take care of her sister. So how could he go up to take care of my aunt? My aunt kept asking me to go to her house to sleep. But I followed my father, so I didn't go. In the countryside, it was very quiet at around 9 o'clock because the villagers went to bed very early. I was still young, so I was given priority to sleep inside the house. The bed was next to the coffin. My father and Uncle Dai slept on a mat in the yard. Actually, There was a bed in the inner room, but because my uncle had slept there before he died, only my aunt and the two of us slept. At first, I also wanted to crawl in there to sleep with him to avoid being scared because there was a coffin in the outer house. But no one let me sleep. Everyone said I had to abstain from something. I didn't know. I slept with my grandmother. She must have been tired and had already fallen asleep. I kept tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Maybe it was because I was unfamiliar with the house and the bed. And maybe it was because I was scared. It was summer, but I was shivering. Maybe it was the breath of the dead person in the coffin that made me feel cold. After lying down for a while, I fell asleep. I don't remember how long I slept, but suddenly I felt cold and woke up. At that time, I remember that I was not fully awake and was still sleepy. The bed I was lying on was facing the gate. My eyes were still looking out there to see if it was morning yet. Suddenly, I saw a dark figure slowly walking from the gate. That day, the moon was bright, so I could see very clearly. When I got closer, I saw that it was a woman, wearing a hat that was pulled down tightly, and on her shoulder was a bag. It wasn't really a bag, but it looked like a cloth basket that the elders used to use to go to the market. Holding a child in her hand. At first, I thought it was morning because the moon was very bright outside. So I thought that a neighbor had come over to invite my uncle to go to the market. But she came in without calling or asking anyone anything. Just slowly walking in. She walked very lightly. I felt like she was flying, not walking. When I got close to the porch where my father and Uncle Di were lying. Oh, my parents. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. She walked past my father and uncle, but they still didn't know anything. Still snoring steadily. Then she approached the coffin and just stood there. Let me describe the position where I was lying and the position where the coffin was installed so that you can understand. The coffin was placed vertically, the end of the coffin facing the door, and the bed I was lying on had the head facing the body of the coffin. About 0.5 meters away, and the end of the bed was facing the wall. I was lying right outside. That woman was only standing more than 1 meter away from me. At that time, I just wanted to turn my neck to wake her up to see what was going on. But I was afraid that if she knew I was still awake, I would die. I tried to open my eyes to see her still standing there. Tried to see her face to see who it was, but couldn't because the light from the oil lamp was too small. And what kind of hat was she wearing that covered most of her face? And the child with her was very strange. I thought it didn't have a face, just a flat white space. It took almost a long time before she turned around and walked towards the door. But strangely enough, when I entered I saw her coming from the gate. When she left I tried to look out the gate but couldn't see her anywhere. I was so scared. I lay still and fell asleep without realizing it. Chapter 2. Taking Uncle to the field. The next morning when I woke up, I saw everyone was busy preparing to put the coffin in the ground at noon. I also started to get up, a little tired from last night's events. When I passed the coffin, I deliberately looked down to where the woman was standing to see if there was anything unusual. I saw a puddle of water, but it had almost dried up. I was so shivering that I ran to the back of the house to wash my face. The early morning air in my hometown is really pleasant. Maybe it's near the forest, near the mountains. If I could live here, my lungs would be as green as banana leaves. While I was brushing my teeth, I heard my aunt upstairs shouting loudly. Not understanding what was going on, I ran upstairs to see, and saw her grumbling and scolding the rats that were running around and knocking down my aunt's memorial photo. At that moment, my skin crawled, thinking about last night. Could it be that the woman had turned my aunt's memorial photo down? It was absurd. If that was the case, I should have heard a noise and seen her move. But at that moment, there was only silence, trying to push all those thoughts out of my head. I also hoped that it was true that the mouse was jumping and that the photo of my uncle was dumped because there was no reason for that woman to ruin my uncle. I quickly ran to the back to continue brushing my teeth. After breakfast, there was nothing to do, so I sat around playing with everything in the house. I looked at my father and Uncle Di running around, going back and forth, and I found it funny. Brotherhood is when we rarely see each other when we are alive. So when one person leaves, we try to help the other person leave comfortably. Sometimes, that's all people need when living together. Around noon, I saw some men pushing a ghost cart, a type of cart used to carry coffins to the fields. The cemetery there was quite a distance from my uncle's house, and to get to the main road, you had to go up a bit further to get there. It was called a cemetery for prestige, but in reality it was a place of ghosts, with all kinds of graves, in a mess without any order. When they were about to take my uncle to the fields, my grandmother and aunt cried even harder, while the children were still laughing and playing with each other. Perhaps they were too young to know that their father was about to lie in the ground forever. Right at noon, everyone started to move the coffin onto the ghost ox cart. At first, only 4 young men rushed in to carry it. After struggling for a while, they said it was too heavy to lift. My uncle was already small, and from the time he got sick until he died, he became even smaller because he couldn't eat anything. Couldn't the young men carry a man weighing more than 40 kilos? My father and uncle helped and found that it was really heavy. Impossible to lift, as if there was a rock inside. At this point, everyone thought that my uncle probably didn't want to leave the house. So my aunt went to the altar to light incense and pray. After praying, everyone tried to carry the coffin. It felt very light. It was true that my uncle still listened to his wife. But when they got to the main road, they couldn't push it anymore. It was as heavy as before. My uncle still didn't want to leave his wife and children. He still wanted to stay home. Everyone had to rest. It was just poor auntie. When my uncle was alive, she ran around to borrow money to treat her husband's illness. When her husband died, she still had to run around to take her husband away. After the wife finished praying, the car started moving smoothly again. From there, when they reached the cemetery, the husband did not want to go many times, but in the end, he listened to his wife and lay down on the ground. Chapter 3. Lou and 2. Behind my uncle's house, there are 2 dogs chained. One is Lou, the other is 2. Both are black dogs. At noon, there was a party, so my aunt had to chain the 2 dogs. Afraid that they would run around and bite people. My aunt said that those 2 dogs were very fierce. They would bite strangers whenever they saw them. After lunch, I often brought bones to throw to them to eat. At that time, I was naive and thought that if I played with them and fed them, they would consider me a friend and not bite me. That night, I heard it growling and thought it wanted to go to the toilet. So I let it out. As soon as the leash was removed, the 2 of them ran out into the alley. Later, my uncle and I were sitting on the porch talking. There were 2 pillars on the porch, and my dad hung a hammock there to lie down and cool off. Two walked slowly in the alley but didn't see Lou. It kept walking and then suddenly jumped up onto the hammock to sit and swing. My uncle chased it down for a while. Then it jumped up again. Uncle Di was so angry that he pulled the hammock down to put it away. But it growled and ran away. When going to bed, my uncle called the 2 children back to tie them up so they wouldn't wander around and get caught. But after calling them over and over again, they couldn't be found, so he gave up, closed the gate and went to sleep. My aunt and my 2 younger siblings, I should call them brother and sister. But they're too young, so I'll just call them younger siblings for ease, slept in the bed where my uncle slept before he passed away. As soon as my aunt came in and turned on the light, she suddenly saw it lying on the bed for a long time. At this time, my 2 younger siblings were still sleeping like the dead. Hearing my aunt scream, my uncle Di and my father ran in. They were both stunned for a moment because of the dog's strange behavior. Then quickly chased it out of bed. But it refused to leave. The 2 children woke up crying when they heard the noise. The whole family was very worried. Later, my father took a mulberry branch and whipped the dog. But it howled loudly and ran away. My aunt was stiff and quickly went to burn incense for my uncle. In everyone's head there is a bunch of feelings that they don't want to say out loud. It was not until late at night that I could finally fall asleep. This time, I asked to sleep with my dad and uncle. While I was dozing off, I suddenly heard a high-pitched laugh coming from the gate. After a while, I heard a dog barking, then howling. After a while, everything was quiet. Only the dog's whining could be heard, as if I had just scolded it and it had realized its mistake. I didn't know what it was. I was shaking so much that I snuggled up next to my dad and uncle, trying to fall asleep, but that sound kept haunting me and I couldn't sleep. Maybe after a while, I was too tired and fell asleep without realizing it. The next morning, as soon as he opened the gate, my uncle was shocked to see 2 and Lou lying dead right at the gate. Their bodies covered with bite marks. The 2 lying about 3 adult steps apart. 2 lying right near the gate. After a closer look, he saw some scratches on the gate. My uncle thought that they had tried to get into the house but couldn't. People still say that dogs bite ghosts. But who bit 2 and Lou? Everyone quickly took the 2 dogs to the back garden and buried them without anyone telling them. It seemed like everyone wanted to avoid talking about the dog. Chapter 4. Memories. That whole day everyone was silent. No one said anything to each other. I wanted to tell the story of last night and the day before but I didn't dare. Just afraid that people wouldn't believe me and say I was too tired and thought bad things. It was very strange. During the day it was fine but at night I had a creepy feeling when I was at my uncle's house. That night I had to stay there again. After we finished eating and drinking, everyone had talked to each other. Then Uncle Di started telling everyone stories from the past. He said that there had been many strange things here since ancient times. That was when my grandparents were still up here. It was only later that the whole family moved down to the lowlands to live because my grandfather's hometown was there. Uncle Dai was only about 11 or 12 years old at that time. One day my grandfather went to play at his friend's house in the next village. And the two villages were only separated by a tiny bridge over the village ditch. That day he also drank alcohol. Not to the point of being drunk but still tipsy. He was very brave, not afraid of anything, not even living or dead ghosts. His friend saw him a bit faint and wanted to take him home, but my grandfather didn't need it. He said he had legs so he could go home by himself. The other friend knew my grandfather's pride, so he stopped. At the beginning of my village at that time there was a very large bamboo bush. I don't know how long it had been there because since my grandfather was a child he had seen it growing there for a long time. People still say that there are ghosts there. So at night that place is deserted and no one comes or goes. If anyone has to leave the village at night, they probably have to find another way. He went home, whistling as he walked. Suddenly a litter of pink piglets came out from the bushes in front of him. There were 5 of them in total. But the mother pig was nowhere to be seen. Seeing the beautiful litter of pigs, he stalked after them to catch them, not knowing whose pigs were roaming free. If he caught them and brought them home, they would be his. That's what he thought at that time. He kept running after them but he couldn't catch up, until he saw them go into the bamboo bushes at the beginning of the village and disappear. He started to go in and look for them. At home, my grandmother saw that it was late and he still hadn't come home. She was afraid that something had happened to him. So she sent Uncle Dai and son to look for him. The whole family rushed to look for him. When they got to the bamboo bush, they saw a pair of sandals there. After looking at it for a while, she knew it was my grandfather's sandals. She told Uncle Dai to hold a torch and shine it into the bamboo bush to see. After shining it into the bamboo bush, everyone was terrified to see my grandfather lying in there. Normally, this bamboo bush was already thick and dense. It would be difficult for a child to crawl in there, let alone an adult. But my grandfather could lie in there and sleep soundly. My grandmother told son to run back to get a knife to cut the bamboo and drag my grandfather out. When she got home, she kept crying. After a while, my grandfather woke up. Everyone rushed in and asked why he was crawling into the bamboo bush at night. He said, "I saw a herd of beautiful piglets so I ran after them to catch them. When I saw them crawling into the bamboo bush, I went in to look for them but couldn't find anything. When I crawled out, I saw them sitting at home." Everyone was scared. No one said anything, but everyone knew that when they pulled him out of the bamboo bush, he still thought he was searching for the pigs and didn't know he had fainted. My grandmother quietly went to the altar to burn incense and pray. My grandfather seemed to know what he had just seen. He quietly went to the well to wash his face and went to sleep. But that was just the beginning because later on, my uncle and I encountered another problem. Because the story is written from what I remember, please take your time and let me remember before continuing. I will try to write as quickly as possible. Please understand. The story may have some rambling parts, but from the beginning I clearly stated that the direction is to tell a series of events that my family encountered. So please forgive me. I don't understand why I have already posted everything down here, but it's so dense. Please read it carefully. Continue part 4. My hometown has a section of the Da River flowing through it. Every January and February it dries up almost half of the river to reveal a beautiful golden sandbank. A few years after the day my grandfather met the ghost, everyone in the family forgot about it. Back then, Uncle Dai and Uncle Sun were very mischievous. At noon, my grandparents made us sleep but we always sneaked out to play. Oh, I forgot to tell you about my grandfather's family background. He had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Uncle Dai and Uncle Sun I just told you. The other 2 girls were my mother and Aunt Nyat. Aunt Nyat later fell in love with my uncle who was from up here, so she didn't follow my grandfather down to the lowlands anymore. That night, my uncle and I invited each other to go to the sandbank to play. Along with some of my uncle's friends. My mother and aunt were afraid of our grandparents so they didn't dare to go. When we got there, everyone was looking for firewood to burn to warm up because it was still cold that day. While we were laughing and joking with each other, Uncle Sun said to go wash his hands. They were too dirty. Everyone sat for a while before remembering that Uncle Sun hadn't come back yet. Uncle Dai immediately called. "Son, what took you so long?" A moment later there was a reply. "Let's go out." Everyone sitting around was startled because it was so dark at this time of year. What was there to play with? Without anyone telling them, each person took a piece of firewood and went to look for where he was playing. When they reached the riverbank, There was still water to look for him because at first he said he was going to wash his hands. But he couldn't see him anywhere. Looking up, they saw a figure running after something. They immediately thought it was Son. So they ran after him. When they caught up, they still saw him smiling and pointing that there was a big festival up there. People were carrying something. Let's go up there and play together. Everyone looked in the direction he was pointing but couldn't see anything. At this time, he kept insisting on going out to play. So Uncle Dai slapped him so hard that his eyes sparkled. He mumbled a few words and then fainted. My uncle carried him back to tell the whole story to the whole family. But my uncle beat him with a whip, almost to death, for always going out and being naughty. My grandmother didn't say anything, just quietly went to light incense and pray again. Uncle Dai and Uncle Son rarely went out at night after that day. Probably because they were scared. Chapter 5. The Brat, the Mistake. After staying at my uncle's house for a few days, I was so scared that I forced my father to stay at my aunt's house. Uncle Dai stayed there because he was worried about my uncle. A week later, I didn't see anything strange. After staying for exactly a week, my father and my uncle and I went back together. This time, my grandmother wanted to stay with my aunt, so my uncle and father complied with her wishes. Because my grandmother was already weak and my uncle had just passed away. Everyone was afraid that she wouldn't be able to handle it because she was walking around too much. When I returned that day, I was still wondering about the night before when I took my uncle to the field and the strange behavior of the two dogs. More than 2 years later, around mid-2005, my hometown called to tell me that Suyen, Kwang's wife, had a miscarriage. Kwang told me over the phone that after taking my aunt away for 3 weeks, Suyen started labor and gave birth to a very cute baby boy. But for some reason he didn't cry and his eyes kept looking somewhere far away. It seemed very far away. Every night when everyone was sleeping, the baby would open his eyes and laugh loudly. But the story didn't stop there. Everyone thought he was just a little different from the others, so they didn't pay much attention. Then suddenly 6 months later he died. He said he didn't understand why the baby was fine but suddenly left us and went away. My cousin, the aunt's father-in-law's sister, came over to visit. After listening to Kwang tell everything, she went inside the house to get a bottle of blue ink. Then made a mark on the sole of the baby's right foot. No one there knew what she was doing, so she kept quiet and quietly left. Sometime later, Ms. Suyen got pregnant again. This time her belly was very pointed. Everyone thought she would give birth to a boy. Mr. Kwang was very happy. But it seemed like all the horrors started to happen again. That time, Ms. Suyen went into labor. Her stomach hurt and she screamed loudly. Mr. Kwang was flustered and didn't know what to do. The clinic was quite far away and this time her labor was so sudden that he wasn't prepared. He told my aunt to look after Ms. Suyen and then he ran to my cousin's house to ask her to help deliver the baby. Before the commune clinic was opened here, my cousin still did the job of delivering babies for people around that area. Everyone told each other that she was a good midwife, so everyone wanted to ask her to help deliver the baby. But since the commune clinic was built until now, doctors have been propagating all kinds of medical information, so people rarely give birth at home but instead go to the clinic. Only the very poor families still have to ask my cousin to help deliver the baby. She went over to urge everyone to boil water, prepare clean towels, knives and scissors for her to do it. Everyone outside was so nervous but still didn't see the baby crying. They only heard Ms. Suyen screaming. Mr. Kwang was anxious and was about to go in to see what was going on when suddenly he heard his cousin screaming. Everyone rushed in to see and saw his cousin sitting on the ground. And the baby was on the bed. Her mouth was still stuttering, and her hand kept pointing at the baby. Then she said a sentence that terrified everyone there. "Your house is haunted. That boy is a bastard. Throw him away." The house was filled with fear. No one said anything. The baby didn't cry, just lay still and looked up at the ceiling. Suyen was probably too tired, so she had fallen asleep. After a while, my cousin slowly spoke. When she lifted him out, she saw that he was a boy. But he didn't cry. His eyes were wide open and looked very scared. Then she lifted his right leg up. She was so scared that she almost dropped him on the ground. His foot had a blue birthmark, right where she had put it before when their first son died. Everyone turned from fear to amazement. She continued. "Your son is a ghost. He has always crawled in and out of your wife's body. But in fact she has never given birth to any children. This time he crawled in to die for the second time." Everyone in the family was shocked. No one said anything, just stood there looking at each other in fear. If the boy suddenly started laughing, I guarantee the whole family would run away. My cousin slowly walked home. And when she got home, she kept muttering. My family is haunted by it. We have to pay for our karma." After she left, the atmosphere in the house became heavier. Kwong put the baby in the cradle, covered his wife with a thin blanket, and quietly went outside to smoke. My aunt also quietly went upstairs. The next morning, he called down to tell my family everything. Chapter 6: The Ducks. I was also shocked when my mother told me, and a few days later I asked for leave to go to the countryside with my mother. She didn't let me go, but I didn't listen and just followed her, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to go out. When I got there, I saw that my uncle's house was much different from before. The pond next to the house seemed to have been reinforced and was wider. They only raised grass carp. When I went up to see the huge school of fish wriggling around, I was so excited that I wanted to take out my fishing rod and fish for fun. When I went down to Kwong's house, I only saw Ms. Suyen at home, looking after the newborn baby. My mother and I went to see him, but he was still awake, but his eyes were staring at the ceiling. My mother called him but he didn't respond. Ms. Suyen sobbed and said he didn't know anything. He only cried when he was hungry. At that time, looking at his eyes, I was really scared. I only dared to sit behind my mother and listen to the two of them talk. At noon, my uncle and Kwong also came back. He looked thinner and thinner. Maybe he was worrying too much. That afternoon, while eating lunch, my mother and my uncle discussed driving up to Hua Bin tomorrow morning to ask the teacher to examine him. My hometown is next to Hua Bin. It's only about 60 kilometers by motorbike. It takes about an hour to get there. I heard from my uncle that there is a very good teacher there. So I went to see what happened to my house. That night, I was so busy playing that I went to take a bath late. The bathroom was quite far from my uncle's house, located next to the pond. While I was splashing water inside, I kept hearing someone calling for ducks outside. I thought I had misheard, so I ignored it and continued bathing. But the sound got closer and closer, and it sounded familiar, so I splashed water and ran out to see what it was. When I just came out, I was almost scared. Sister Suyen was groping around the pond to do something. I heard her mouth continuously calling out words like she was herding ducks. Unfortunately, I couldn't see anything, but she kept calling. I called out loudly, "What are you doing, Ms. Suyen?" There was no answer. I ran back and almost threw her to the ground. Looking at her at that time was very scary. She looked like a lost soul. She kept going to the middle of the pond to do something. I was so scared that I shouted. After a while my uncle, mother and Kwong ran out. Kwong ran straight into the pond to pick up his wife, but she kept struggling and wanted to bite Kwong. At this time my mother immediately ran to a nearby mulberry tree. When she turned back she saw her holding a mulberry branch. Not knowing what to do, my mother told me to go into the house to get a rope to tie my sister up. I was so scared that my hands and feet were wrapped around each other and I couldn't run. My uncle quickly went in and grabbed the rope and took it out. After tying my sister up, my mother told Kwong to pee on her right away. He felt sorry for his wife and was embarrassed, so he didn't dare. Later my mother yelled at him so much that he dared, but it took a long time for him to push it out. When Kwong peed, looking at Suyen at that time was very scary. Her eyes were bulging. I looked at her and thought it was bright red. After peeing, my mother held the mulberry branch and whipped her while cursing. "Fuck you, get out." Mom kept whipping and cursing, while Suyen kept getting angry, as if she was in a lot of pain. Her mouth kept whining something but she couldn't get any air out. After a while, the sisters suddenly sat still, laughed loudly a few times, then fainted. Mom told the brothers to carry her into the house and scrape her back. After a while, she woke up. Everyone asked how she got to the pond in the middle of the night. She said she was going to the toilet when suddenly she saw a flock of ducks quacking by. She thought the ducks had come out of the co-op, so she chased them. When she got to the pond she saw them swimming to the middle of the pond, so she went out to herd them in. After that she didn't know anything anymore. At that time, my mother told me that the house was haunted by a ghost and that I had to go see it tomorrow. It was going to blindfold me and kill my family. I also described that the pond next to my uncle's house was quite deep. I heard my brothers say that even though they were over 1.7 meters tall, they could swim in there and walk to the middle of the pond and their heads would be submerged. Before going to bed, my mother told my brothers to pee around the entrance before they could go to sleep. Lying down to sleep, I thought to myself that I was lucky that the ghost had possessed me and now everyone would be rushing to find me without knowing that I had sunk into the pond. That's why every house in the countryside has a mulberry tree, probably to ward off ghosts. I'm going to text my girlfriend first. She's been urging me for a while now, but I was so engrossed in writing that I didn't notice. Chapter 7. Misfortune. It seemed like no one could sleep tonight. Mom kept tossing and turning, and in the room I could hear my aunt sighing, looking at the clock to see what time it was. I bumped into my uncle's memorial photo. The photo showed him smiling brightly, but why did I feel like he was glancing at me and smiling mysteriously? I quickly glanced at the clock and saw that it was almost 2 a.m. So I quickly crawled behind my mother and hid my face there to sleep. After lying down for a while, suddenly there was a call from outside the gate. Since Tu and Lu died, my uncle's family didn't dare to keep dogs anymore, so the atmosphere became even more eerie. The call from the door was very urgent. I pinched my mother and she told me to lie still and go to sleep. But I was so scared that I couldn't sleep. A while later, I started to hear loud calls and knocking on the gate. Ms. Wah, open the door for me quickly. Wah is my aunt's name. Her voice sounds very similar to my cousin's, but because they were scared, no one dared to go out to see who was calling. It seemed like they knew everyone in the house was afraid of ghosts. So the people outside called out loudly. Then, open the door, I'm not a ghost. As soon as I finished speaking, I saw my uncle coming out of the room with a flashlight in his hand, looking furtively at my mother. Then he said, I think I heard Ms. K calling you, Auntie. My mother and I also nodded in agreement, but no one wanted to go out. Taking a risk, my mother flipped the headboard over to get the mulberry branch, which turned out to have been hidden there since last night, while I hurried off. I took another flashlight and followed my mother and uncle to the gate. My uncle and I shined the flashlight and saw a woman standing at the gate. I was so scared that I wanted to go in but still tried to stop to see who it was. When my mother opened the gate, it was indeed my cousin. She looked very tired. After she entered the house, my mother asked, What do you have to do that you had to come here so late? I looked at the clock and it was 2:30 in the morning. She looked very tired. Her eyes were dark and puffy as if she had not slept. She drank all the water in one gulp and then sat down and slowly said, Your father-in-law just came back. Wah. Wah is my aunt's name. She asked in panic. Why did Dad come back? Uncle, why did Dad come back to your house instead of home? She continued. He really wanted to go home but couldn't. Your house had a ghost guarding the gate. Everyone was shocked, not understanding what was happening. Then her eyes became fixed as if she was looking somewhere very far away. She sighed and began to tell everyone the reason for everything. It happened almost half a century ago. My maternal grandfather gave birth to 5 children in total, but one of them died as a child due to premature birth. The second child was my uncle Hoa's father-in-law. The next 3 were all girls. My maternal grandmother and my cousin were 2 sisters. There was another grandmother, but she is now living with her husband in Hanoi. She has nothing to do with the story I'm telling, so please allow me to stop mentioning her. When he was 26, he asked his father to let him go down to the lowlands to work with a friend, because he had nothing to do if he stayed at home. That year, he followed his friend to Tai Bin to work for a red brick factory owned by an acquaintance. At first, he was very hardworking, agile, and active, so the boss liked him very much. But unfortunately, later on, he followed bad friends, got involved in drinking and gambling, and spent all the money he earned on gambling all night. At that time, he met a female worker who also worked there named Ha. She was famous for being beautiful and obedient, so everyone in the factory liked her. The male workers there also flirted with her, but she still didn't like anyone. For some reason, she paid attention to her younger brother. Those other men kept writing love letters and poems of all kinds, but she didn't have any feelings for them. At that time, my brother didn't care about her at all. He just considered her as a friend of my sister because at home, the elders had already arranged a match for her. In the past, in the countryside, there was still the concept that parents arranged for their children to follow their lead. Both boys and girls, if parents told them to marry someone, they just had to follow it. As time passed, it seemed that the fire near the straw would eventually catch fire. He also began to respond to Ms. Ha's love, made all kinds of promises and moved in together. Then one day, he and she did what husband and wife should do. At that time, he still did not know how the words he said that night had harmed him and his children and grandchildren. They have been in love and living together almost like husband and wife for a while now. But he still cannot give up his drinking and gambling habits. Ms. Ha advised him over and over again, but he just mumbled and continued the next day. Every night he would come home drunk. His salary was not enough for him to spend. Sometimes he even forced Ms. Ha to give him money to go gambling. Seeing that his friend was not working hard, his friend wrote a letter, explaining everything and sent it home. After hearing the news, my grandfather was furious. He personally went to my grandfather's workplace and told him to go home and not work anymore. He was so surprised that he didn't know what to do. Miss Ha ran out and knelt down to beg for my grandfather. It seemed like he knew that this was his son's lover. He became even more angry, kicked the other girl and fell backwards, then jumped in and slapped my grandfather. The two of them didn't know what to do, so they just knelt down and cried and begged him. Not only did his anger not subside, he also forced my grandfather to return to his hometown that very day to prepare for the wedding. My brother was afraid of my father. He didn't dare to argue with anything my father said. Only Miss Ha dared to stand up and ask to marry my brother. Because at that time she was carrying his blood. At that time, both my grandfather and my father were surprised. He didn't know that Miss Ha was pregnant, but he was a coward, afraid of my grandfather's scolding, so he denied that the fetus was his. After hearing my brother's words, Miss Ha was shocked. She didn't expect those words to come out of my brother's mouth, and also didn't expect that she would love such a cowardly and deceitful person. She cried and ran away. After returning to his hometown for nearly a month, his brother got married, who later became Ho's mother-in-law. As the years passed, everyone forgot all about the past. The only strange thing was that even though they got married, every time they got pregnant, they had a miscarriage. It was only later that they gave birth. My uncle was born prematurely and was difficult to raise, so he was small since he was a child. At that time, everyone was happy and relieved because my maternal side had a successor. As for Ms. Ha, no one knew anything about her afterwards, but the friend who went with my brother at that time said that the night he went back to his hometown with his grandfather, she also left, and then also disappeared since then. Chapter 8. Miss Ha. As soon as she finished speaking, there were suddenly loud banging sounds like someone was throwing rocks on the roof. I was about to curse whoever was so stupid as to throw rocks on someone's roof and break the tiles. But then I remembered that it was almost 3 a.m., so I did it. No one has time to stand outside throwing rocks. Every 5 minutes or so, we hear that sound. My cousin signals everyone to be quiet and whispers, "There it is." "Who is it?" Everyone was in an uproar, wondering what was going on. My grandmother whispered, "It's back. Ha is back." The noise seemed to stop. Everyone sat still. The images in the story she had just told appeared clearly in everyone's mind like a movie. About him, about Ms. Ha, about everything. There was no more stone throwing. But suddenly there was a loud cry from behind the house. Then there was a cackle. Everyone turned pale, looked at each other, then fell silent again. My uncle went to the altar to burn incense for the ancestors and my uncle. Just as he finished putting the incense in the bowl, suddenly the fire flared up, and my uncle's photo fell down under the table. He ran to where everyone was standing, panting and pointing. "Only, maybe your mouth is stiff. Cannot say a word." Needless to say, everyone there had seen it all. Fear written all over their faces. Even my mother, who was considered the most stubborn and daring, didn't know what to say. People were shaking. Me too. If I was a little younger I would have cried and peed my pants. Ah ah ah. Kwang's scream downstairs caught everyone's attention. I rushed out to see what immediately caught my eye. Kwang's house was at the end of the pond, directly opposite Hoa's house. At that moment, I saw Suyen with messy hair, slowly walking up to where everyone was standing. I don't know why, but even though it was dark, I felt like her face was very bright, smiling in a very strange way. She was holding a bag of something in her hand. No, it wasn't a bag. Looking closely, I saw that it seemed to be a baby. There was a loud laugh coming from there, so I guessed that she just walked back towards Hoa's house alone. After a while, my cousin told everyone too. The person went inside and immediately closed the door. When the door slowly closed, I seemed to see Ms. Suyen suddenly run up, walking very fast, as if trying to run to get into the house before everyone closed the door. The moment I saw her like that haunts me until now. Guys. 5 minutes, 10 minutes passed. Everything was so quiet. There was no movement outside. Suddenly there was a knocking sound. Then a knocking sound from the entrance. I sat on a nearby chair and felt like someone was trying to open the door. My sweat poured out like a shower. I didn't know what I was afraid of anymore. It was like the fear that some monster would kick the door open and eat everyone. Then everything was quiet again. Everyone looked at each other tensely. Suddenly bang. The door seemed like someone was kicking it hard from the outside. The latch was shaking as if the door could open at any moment. Mom waved me in and gave me a bowl to pee in. Oh my god, now I don't have the mind to pee or pee anymore. I frowned, shook my head, The second sound of kicking the door rang out again. The weak wooden door seemed unable to take it anymore. My mother grabbed me and told me to pee there quickly. I closed my eyes and pointed the fishing rod straight into the bowl and peed. This time it was silent again. Everyone tried to hold their breath waiting for any movement but saw nothing. 30 minutes passed. My cousin started to stand up and walk towards the door. Everyone slowly followed. As soon as the door opened, everyone saw no one outside. Looking around but still saw nothing. Just about to go down to see what happened to Kwang. From the bathroom, Miss Suyen was slowly walking up. My cousin shouted loudly, "Is that Suyen? What are you doing out there at night?" There was no answer. She just walked straight towards everyone. About 3 meters away, from behind, my mother picked up the bowl of urine one had just peed in and threw it straight at my sister. Suddenly she screamed. The baby in her arms also screamed a few sentences. Shrilly. My mother immediately ran to my sister, still holding the mulberry branch that she had kept since last night. But this time it seemed to be dipped in my urine. I saw water dripping down. My mother closed her eyes and wept. Every time she brought the mulberry branch down, my sister Suyen would scream out in terrifying sounds. This time I saw my mother just hit my sister's ankle. After a while she fell down and fainted. As for the little boy, it seemed like he was sleeping. Had been asleep for a long time. Luckily when my sister fell, the boy didn't hit his head on the ground. Even though he was a ghost, everyone still considered him a grandchild. And no one wanted to see anything happen to their grandchild. I carried my sister to the bed so that the doctor could. I scraped the wind, and my mother and grandmother ran downstairs to see how Kwang was. As soon as they got there, everyone saw Kwang lying right in front of the door, his mouth wide open. Perhaps he fainted because he was so scared. My mother slapped him a few times until he woke up. His face was dirty. He looked around furtively, then asked, "Where is she?" "No, my wife?" My mother told me everything that had just happened. Kwang's face turned pale, and he said, breathing heavily, "She told me to wipe the urine at the door but I forgot. I was sleeping and suddenly heard a noise so I woke up. When I woke up, I saw my wife holding the baby and opening the door to go out. I called her but she didn't respond so I ran out to see what was wrong with her. But as soon as I got there, I saw my wife's face. Oh no, she..." He kept stuttering and couldn't form words. My mother quickly gave him a glass of water and then he continued. "I saw my wife's face was a woman smiling. I was so scared that I fainted." No one said a word to each other. Everyone was silent. It was almost morning when my grandmother told my mother that it was lucky that my mother was born in the year of the tiger. Otherwise our family would have met with disaster yesterday. And it was true. Everyone. My mother was born in 1962 Nam Dan. She has never been afraid of ghosts. She said she is only afraid of black-headed ghosts. It seems like I am her child so ghosts are more afraid of my urine than normal urine. Chapter 9. Teacher Ka, Peace. The next morning, because of a sleepless night, everyone was tired. We planned to leave for Hua Bin at 8 a.m. I will not say where it is in Hua Bin province to ensure the privacy of the characters. I will also change the characters' names to find the teacher. The solution was to resolve the issue. But Suyen was still unconscious, so no one dared to go. At first, my mother told me to stay home to look after her. But I was so scared that when she woke up, she would jump in and strangle her. So I insisted on going with my mother. After a while, I realized that leaving anyone at home was not a good idea. Luckily, my cousin told everyone to go ahead and stay home to look after her. So my mother felt a little more at ease. This trip had 4 people in total. That was my mother, Aunt Hua, Kwang and me. After breakfast, at exactly 8 o'clock everyone started to leave. But while preparing to go, the car that Aunt Hua was sitting in just started up and then suddenly died. And it wouldn't start. Kwang ran over to check what was wrong with the car. But he didn't see any problem. It was still normal. My cousin told Kwang to try his car to see if there was anything wrong. But strangely, his car also couldn't start. Knowing that something was wrong, while struggling not knowing what to do, my grandmother told my mother to get in the car and try to start the engine. My mother just sat in the car and started it up. She waved her hand and told my mother to go out to the main road. Leave the car there and come back to get Kwang's car. After struggling for a while, everyone settled down and started the trip to find the teacher. The road up there was not as close as I thought at first. There were few houses around, only mountains. I was sitting in the back and felt sleepy so I kept nodding off. I didn't know how long it would take. I just knew I was very tired. I kept asking as I walked. The road took quite a while. The shaman whose house I was about to go to was named Ka. I don't know if he still practices fortune-telling and exorcism now. But many people knew him in the past. While I was half asleep, the car stopped in front of a 2-story house. I thought I was going to the shaman's house, so I jumped out of the car. I had to admit that I was very excited when I left. But when I got there, I felt creepy, goosebumps all over my body. I kept thinking that there were a lot of ghosts inside these shamans' houses. Someone had also told me before that shamans' houses often kept ghost soldiers. So I was also shaking. Mom stood at the gate and called into the house. "Uncle Ka, are you home?" After waiting for a while, an old man around 70 years old came out, his face wrinkled, his mouth toothless, asking who it was, then invited everyone into the house. I really didn't want to go in at all. At first I wanted to tell my mom to just leave the car here and I'll sit and watch it. But I thought better of it. I kept standing at the gate, making my mom glare at me, afraid that she would scold me. I slowly walked in. When I got to the house, the first thing I noticed was that this teacher's house wasn't as gloomy as I thought. There were a lot of potted plants in the yard. There was a tiled house downstairs. I guessed it was a warehouse or a kitchen because it looked a bit old. He must have been the only one in the house because I didn't see anyone say anything since then. Entering the house, what immediately caught my eye was an altar with bright red lights. I sat down and counted them over and over again and saw that there were 11 incense bowls in total. Big and small, divided into 3 altars. The top one was for Buddha and the bottom one was for various gods. I don't know about that either, but it feels very peaceful and not creepy at all. Different from the gods that I see people worship. He poured water for the guests and then asked with a toothless voice. Looking at his gentle demeanor, I immediately felt sympathy for him. "Did you come here today to ask me to catch a ghost?" Surprised by his question, my whole family nodded vigorously. My mother replied, "Sir, it seems like my house is haunted. Please help us find out and protect us." He smiled again and began to speak. "I know. Right when you came in I saw a woman and a child following you. It's a ghost. Now it's probably standing at the gate because no ghost dares to enter my house." Everyone was speechless. It turned out that it had been following my family since home. I don't know whose car it was riding in just now. My mother eagerly said to the teacher, "Now that you know everything, I would like to ask you to follow us home to help my family overcome the problem. Everyone in the family has been having trouble sleeping for the past few days. I am very grateful to you, Master." He continued, "You two go home first. Take this and stick it on the door and the 4 corners of the house. Go home and prepare the offerings first. Now I have to go help someone. They told me yesterday. They will come pick me up soon." After saying that, he slipped a stack of yellow amulets into my mother's hand, on which, drawing some very strange symbols. My mother was worried and kept urging him to come back and help. But he refused so tactfully that she had to give up. Before leaving, he gave my mother a small bodhisattva statue, telling her to use it if the 5 charms didn't work tonight. Everyone said goodbye to him and got in the car to leave. I felt that I respected him, so I greeted him very politely. Unlike the first time, when I saw him, it was like seeing a ghost. Looking at the sun, it was almost noon, so everyone decided to go to their aunt's house nearby, partly because they were hungry, and partly because everyone was tired after traveling such a long distance. So I wanted to find a place to rest and then go home in the afternoon. This lady is Hoa's older sister. She is also over 50 years old. She looks very plump, but her face is a bit fierce. After eating and sleeping, I looked at the clock and it was already past 3 p.m. Everyone was anxious to go home right away, but she kept me to eat. Evening, everyone begged politely but still couldn't get in, so out of respect for them, everyone stayed to have dinner and then went home. At 6:45, everyone was in a hurry to go home. I saw this woman. I didn't feel anything, so I didn't say hello. Just got in the car and went straight home. It was May, but it was already starting to get dark. I was sleepy again. I saw a motorbike ahead that seemed to be going the same way as us. So my mother followed behind. To feel less scared because the road was very deserted. After a while, I felt something strange. A few minutes ago, I looked across the road and saw a milestone saying that 60 kilometers were left before reaching my home. But now I continued walking and it still said that there were 60 more kilometers. Panicked, thinking I was seeing things, I called my mom. She slowed down the car to see what was going on. I almost screamed, and saw the same signpost. Looking up ahead, I saw the motorbike still going slowly. I couldn't see clearly who was sitting on the motorbike. I didn't know if it was a man or a woman. I just saw a black mass. My mom had been looking at me all this time. He was driving so he didn't pay attention to the road. He waved Kwong to stop the car and then his mother said, "Don't go anymore. I'm blindfolded. If we stop, we won't run out of gas." The tension was evident on everyone's faces. It turned out that the car in front of us had been leading us in circles without us even realizing it. When we looked up, the car had disappeared. It was clear that something had happened to me, so no one said anything. Mr. Kwong was angry and shouted, "Let me and Ms. Hua go ahead and scout the way. If we just sit here, who knows when we'll get home?" My mother sighed and said that even if we went, we wouldn't be able to find the way, so he just took us in circles to save gas so we could go home. But it was strange. The road was straight, not winding. Suddenly, my family members kept going and then returned to the starting point. It was completely dark now. Everyone was worried. Everyone sat still for a while, then suddenly remembered the Bodhisattva statue that Mr. Ka gave them. My mother took it out, chanted Namo Amitabha and continued walking. I don't know if it has any effect or not, but my mother kept holding it and reading it. After a while, the car started to move to another part of the road. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief and accelerated to quickly go home. I tried to look back to see if I saw anyone, but I didn't see anyone. Luckily, I did. Chapter 10. I'm haunted. On the way back, Hua kept urging Kwong to hurry up and go home because she suddenly felt impatient. Mom and I kept smiling because we thought she was scared. When we got home, it was already past 8:30. Suyen was awake and sitting with my grandmother upstairs, hearing the sound of everyone's cars. My grandmother and sister rushed out to ask all sorts of questions. Maybe they were coming home too late, so they were worried. My mother also told us everything, like how the teacher told us this, how we met relatives like this, and finally how a ghost blindfolded us and didn't let us go home. When I heard the last part, I saw that my grandmother and Suyen were sitting still, not saying anything anymore, but in the end, we breathed a sigh of relief because this trip was safe and no one was hurt. Everyone at home had been restless from noon until now. Mom went inside the house to look around for a while and then told Kwong to stick all the amulets according to Master Ka's instructions. As for the statue of Bodhisattva, Mom gave it to Suyen to hold, because she was the most vulnerable person in the house, afraid that she would be possessed by a ghost like the previous days. Today, everyone went upstairs to sleep. But that's right, Kwong and Suyen's house probably wouldn't dare sleep there tonight even if they were given money. As for Nok and Hang, my aunt's two daughters, Grandma had already taken them to Aunt Nyat's house to stay there since morning. It was best to let them go away from home for a day or two to end this matter. Otherwise, if something unfortunate happened, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. My aunt and uncle knew about the matter and wanted to go over to help. But Grandma stopped them, because even if they went over, it would only get in the way. What could they do to help? They would wait until the master came and then decide later. My mother told everyone the problem now was the little boy sleeping downstairs. Should we bring him up here or not? I frowned, afraid that if I brought him up at night, he would laugh loudly and I would only pee my pants. Sister Suyen loved the little boy, so she insisted that we bring him up here to live with everyone. Seeing how sorry she was, everyone decided to let him come up here too. But strangely, every time we picked him up and were about to bring him into the house, he would cry. No matter how we tried to comfort him, we couldn't. We tried to pick him up and carry him back several times but still couldn't. I guessed that it was because the house had a spell on it, so he was afraid and didn't dare to come in. So I had to leave him downstairs and lock the door. Because if we took the spell off now, I was afraid that something would happen tonight. I also breathed a sigh of relief, feeling less scared. While I was sitting and listening to my mother's story, my stomach suddenly hurt so much. I don't know what I ate or drank this afternoon, but now my stomach is protesting so much. Thinking about having to go to the toilet alone at this time, I would probably die. But if I sat on the potty or invited someone to go with me, I would be embarrassed because I'm an adult, not a child, and I'm a man, so I decided to go in there and masturbate alone. It wasn't too late, so I wasn't afraid. My uncle's toilet was set back from the bathroom, facing the banana grove in the garden above. Back then, the toilet was just a few pieces of wood put together temporarily to sit on for politeness. All the products fell into the pond for the fish to eat. That's called the vac farming process. Guys. At one point I felt relieved, but I seemed to hear something rustling outside. I opened my eyes slightly from the tarpaulin and saw a dark figure. I didn't know who it was, heading straight up the cassava hill. I felt so strange. I didn't know who was climbing up there at this hour. Weren't they afraid of ghosts? I was thinking when suddenly, something was thrown to the right of the toilet. My body jerked, not because I was afraid of what it had just thrown to tease me, but because I didn't see the thrown object fall into the pond. My mind imagined all sorts of things. I quickly finished and ran into the house, not daring to look back anymore. With a pale face, I walked to where my mother was sitting and crawled into the middle. After sitting for a while, I yawned. My mother told me to go to bed first and sleep later. I was very sleepy, so I jumped onto the bed. But after lying down for a while, I felt a cold chill down my spine, as if someone was staring at me from behind. I turned around and saw nothing. I looked at the window that pointed straight out to the garden and felt so gloomy. I was about to reach out and close it, but the air in the house was stuffy because it was summer. So I stopped. Whatever happened, I just went to sleep. I was sleeping soundly when suddenly I felt someone pinching my hand and jerking me awake. I opened my eyes and it was my mother. I didn't understand why my mother was calling me up at this hour, so I grumbled and yelled. She signaled me to be quiet and told me to sit on the chair with everyone. It was already past 10 o'clock, but everyone was still awake. Everyone looked tense and looked towards the door. I didn't know anything. My mother told me to sit still, so I sat down too. After sitting for a while, I thought I heard something. It sounded like wooden clogs hitting the yard, as if someone was walking back and forth outside. The footsteps were very slow. As soon as they got close to the door, they stopped and then left. Houses in the countryside often had a staircase higher than the yard. So as soon as they got there, the footsteps turned in another direction. I kept imagining that there was something very scary outside, walking back and forth but unable to enter my house. Suddenly, the little boy downstairs cried out. Miss Suyen felt sorry for her son and thought something was wrong and wanted to go down to see. But luckily Mr. Kwong held him back in time. My grandmother yelled at me to sit still. Then she didn't dare to stand up anymore. The little boy was still crying. I don't know what happened to him that made him cry so much. My grandmother was holding a rosary, muttering Buddhist prayers. Poof! The yellow light bulb in the house suddenly went out. Why would there be a power outage at this hour? Everyone started to stir. After a while, Kwong found a lighter and temporarily lit the oil lamp on the altar. Everyone looked at each other tensely. The little boy stopped crying. Everything was eerily quiet again. Suddenly outside the door there was a call. Very small. Mom, open the door for me. That was the voice of Nok, Aunt Hoa's eldest child. She was at her aunt's house, but how could she run back here? This time it was Aunt Hoa's turn to be impatient. She didn't know if she was her child or not, but her voice sounded like she was burying her face in a basin of water and babbling. She told Aunt Hua to leave her alone, no matter what she called. She couldn't answer. At this moment I also remembered that the gate was locked, so no one outside could get in. Surely the person calling outside was someone else and not Nok. The calls kept coming, as if urging the people inside to open the door immediately. Her chanting of Buddha's name became louder and louder, as if to suppress everyone's fear. After a while everything fell silent again. No more calls. No more children crying. The oil lamp was dim, sometimes flickering as if it was about to go out, making me feel the atmosphere in the house was even more terrifying. After sitting for a while, I suddenly felt cold, so I asked my mother. She also said that she suddenly felt goosebumps. And not just the two of us, but everyone in the house felt the same. It was so unreasonable to suddenly feel cold in the summer. Looking around the house for a while, I saw that the window where the bed I had just been lying on was wide open. And it turned out that the wind was blowing in from there. I immediately ran out to close the door. But oh my God, my heart felt like it was about to fall out of my chest. Outside the window, the woman with the sack that I met 2 years ago was standing there, wearing a hat that covered her entire face. While I was mumbling and not having time to call out, the oil lamp on the table suddenly went out. My mind was completely dizzy. I swear that if that woman just reached out and stroked my face, I could have had a heart attack and died right then. There was really no light, but I could see her very clearly. She didn't look like a ghost at all. She looked very real and not an illusion. I screamed once and then fell back on the bed, unconscious, and didn't know what was going on anymore. Later, when I woke up, I smelled a strong smell of essential oil. I guessed that my mother had scraped my back again. Seeing me struggling in bed, everyone ran to me and asked what I saw that made me scream and faint. I told them everything, including the story of 2 years ago when I saw her standing next to my uncle's coffin, and the story of how she seemed to flip my uncle's memorial photo that night. After telling the story, I cried like a baby. Even though I was 14 years old at that time, I was really scared. Her image haunted me. It's been 7 years, but I still can't forget that day because what I saw made me feel like she was a living woman, not a ghost. Chapter 11. Knock. It was just dawn when Ms. Suyen rushed downstairs to see if the baby was okay. But when she opened the door, she saw that he was still lying under the mosquito net, sleeping soundly, with no signs of him kicking and crying like last night. Ms. Hua was worried because of Knock's calls last night, so she took her motorbike and rushed to my aunt's house to see if the two children were still there. I waited patiently with my mother in the kitchen for breakfast. Today I feel the air is fresh and pleasant, completely different from last night. If it weren't for those ghosts, I would really like to stay here because it's far from the city, far from the roads. The countryside atmosphere is so quiet that it makes people feel comfortable. While frowning and eating a bowl of instant noodles, I saw my uncle slowly walking from the gate. I looked around but couldn't see his motorbike. His face looked like he had lost his soul. I greeted him but he didn't react, so I continued eating. I saw him go down to the kitchen for a while. Then he suddenly shouted, "Where did Knock go? Aunt D and Aunt K?" Then my uncle cried. I ran down to see what happened and saw my uncle said that this morning he went to Aunt Nyat's house to see how the two little girls were. Then my aunt said that he had come to pick them up last night. So why did he come here to ask? I panicked. I dropped my chopsticks on the ground. Yesterday my uncle and I didn't come back until late at night. Who would have time to come pick them up? Knowing that something bad had happened, my aunt called everyone to go look for them. Kwong and I immediately thought of the worst-case scenario. That something happened to her on the sandbank. At this time of year we were afraid she would go there and slip and fall into the river. But when we asked the houses around there, they said that no children were playing. We breathed a sigh of relief and went home to search around our house. At this time my uncle and aunt also came to help. After searching for a while, it seemed frustrating, so everyone sat on the porch to wait and see what happened because they still thought she had gone out somewhere. Suddenly, Ms. Suyen stood at the edge of the pond next to the bathroom and shouted loudly. Everyone ran out to see and saw her holding a pink plastic slipper. It seemed like she knew it was her daughter's slipper. So Ms. Hua cried loudly. Mr. Kwong and my uncle looked at each other for a while and then jumped into the pond to search. But strangely, they searched all around the pond and swam to the middle of the pond to search but still found nothing. My mother was about to ask to rent a pump to pump out all the water to search when my cousin told Ms. Suyen to go inside the house to get a blunt sickle and an old shirt of Knock. No one knew what she was going to do. Everyone just watched. I saw her tie the shirt to the handle of the sickle and row the boat to the middle of the pond and drop it. After stirring for a while, suddenly a bag of something floated up in the middle of the pond. When everyone looked closely, they were shocked because it was Knock's body. She was lying face down in the water. Her belly was swollen, probably full of water inside. When he was brought to shore, his eyes rolled back as if he had seen something terrifying. Mr. Kwong stroked them all the way but they still wouldn't close. Uncle Hua cried loudly. She felt sorry for her son. The family was already short of people and now another person had left her. Seeing her cry, everyone else had tears in their eyes too. My uncle got married late and only had 2 daughters. Knock is only 7 years old this year, and Hang was born 2 years after her sister. They are very obedient, but I didn't expect this to happen today. Yesterday the gate was closed, so I don't know how she got in. Or maybe she was home last night without anyone knowing. Everyone started to prepare a coffin and everything for the funeral. Because she was still young, they would take her to the field this afternoon. In the countryside, there is a belief that if a child dies, it must be buried that same day, and not left at home. At 2 p.m., everyone started to carry the girl's coffin to the field. Luckily, the coffin wasn't as heavy as last time. I was thinking, is this girl not attached to her family or something that she's willing to go so easily? Just as I finished thinking, suddenly, the 2 people carrying the coffin sat down on the ground. They said they were moving it to the car when suddenly the coffin was too heavy to carry. Aunt Hua saw that and thought that her daughter couldn't bear to go. So she hobbled to the altar to light incense and pray. But after praying, the coffin was still heavy. It seemed like this time she died so tragically that she didn't want to go. At this time, my grandmother quietly went to get the sickle that she had just used to retrieve her body. She knocked on the coffin 3 times and then told the other 2 men to try to carry it. The coffin was so light that I couldn't understand it. I stood there watching with wide eyes. There are truly many strange things in folklore that science cannot explain. I also followed everyone to take him to the field. When I got there I saw a small hole dug right next to the old uncle's grave. Probably everyone wanted to put the father and son close together, so they did that. Before filling the soil, my grandmother threw down the sickle and the old shirt that belonged to him earlier and whispered something. Now I still wonder how my grandmother could know so many interesting and strange things. After putting the coffin in the ground, everyone came back. That afternoon my mother told Kwong to go to Hua Bin to pick up teacher Ka right away. Because if this situation continued, it would not be good. Chapter 12. The Past, Resolving. It was almost 6 o'clock but Kwong had not returned. Everyone was getting more anxious. Hua must have been too tired so she fell asleep on the bed. Hang saw her mother like that and also lay still. Her face looked very sad and pitiful. Today was her sister's funeral but I didn't see her cry, but looking at her eyes I felt sad. No one asked but she didn't answer. Relatives in the family kept passing away one by one. It was pitiful. I didn't know if Hua could overcome this shock. I was thinking about it when I heard the sound of a motorbike outside the gate. Guessing that Kwong had returned, so everyone rushed out. That was true. This time Mr. Ka also returned. As soon as I entered the gate I saw him frowning just like the time my mother and I came. Today he was wearing a black silk shirt, a turban on his head, carrying a suitcase. Probably in it were all his ghost-catching tools. He looked very impressive. As soon as he sat down at the table he said immediately, "At the gate of your house there are 2 black dogs standing at the gate. Like this the ghosts of the house will not dare to come back." My whole family was surprised. The house didn't have any dogs, but there was a pair of black dogs. But then suddenly remembered that they seemed to be Lu and Tu. No wonder a few days ago my grandmother said that he didn't dare to come home because there was a ghost guarding the gate. Could it be these 2 dogs? After saying that, the teacher went outside, looked around, and went to the back of the house. Then he went back into the house and continued talking. "That guy told me everything. Your house is haunted by an evil spirit. I told you so but you didn't pay any attention. I just feel sorry for the little girl." He sighed and drank all the tea in one gulp. He told everyone to go upstairs to sleep today, and let him sleep downstairs with the boy. If they saw anything strange, they were not to open the door, even if they heard him calling. Today, I didn't see him smiling like usual. His face was very serious. The whole family just said yes, yes, and did everything he said. I felt like something was very strange today, but I didn't know what it was. I just felt restless and nauseous. My grandmother was still staying. She said that if she went home now, she wouldn't feel at ease. I felt sorry for her. She had been thinking about these things for several days now. She was getting old, and I was afraid that if she got sick, everyone wouldn't know what to say. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a start because of the sound of footsteps in the yard. It felt like there were a lot of people and then people talking to each other, but it was very small. I couldn't hear clearly if it was people or the sound of the wind. Suddenly, I remembered that there was no wind in this season. I was so scared that I lay close to Kwong. He was sleeping so soundly. I looked up at the upper bed and saw that everyone else was also sleeping soundly. Could it be that they couldn't hear anything and were still sleeping? I lay still, trying to fall asleep, reassured that since Mr. Ka was coming today, nothing would happen. I followed my grandmother and lay down and recited a few Namo Amitabha verses. While lying down, suddenly there was a knock on the door. Then a voice rang out. "Open the door for me, landlord." I heard every word clearly, because Kwong and I were lying on the floor next to the door. And I also heard clearly that it was Mr. Ka's voice. My teeth were chattering. I lightly scratched Kwong's back but he didn't react at all. Outside, the knocking and calling continued to ring out steadily. I couldn't imagine what was outside, because it was too terrifying for me. I had never needed someone by my side like that. I lay still, ignoring them, still muttering prayers. After a while, there was no more sound. Now there was only the sound of frogs croaking. When I woke up in the morning, I felt like I was completely exhausted. I hadn't slept well for several nights. Everyone had already gotten up to cook breakfast for the teacher. I looked at him furtively, suspiciously, wanting to ask but didn't dare. But I guessed it wasn't him because there was no reason for him to come up to the house at midnight like that, and if he had called, he would have asked me this morning why I didn't open the door for him last night. The morning air was fresh but I suddenly felt very stuffy. I looked out into the yard and shivered. Not knowing what horrible things had happened here last night, I staggered to the back of the house to brush my teeth and then went in to have breakfast. My grandmother was carrying a bunch of offerings back. My mother and sister Suyen were butchering chicken and making sticky rice. Looking at everyone today, it was as if the house was having a party. Aunt Hua and Hang were still sleeping. Everyone didn't have the heart to wake them up. 2 mats were spread out in the middle of the yard to display the offerings and a place for the priest to sit and perform the ceremony. A while later, I saw my mother bring a plate of sticky rice and a steaming chicken. The priest told her to wake up Aunt Hua to perform the ceremony, because she was now the head of the house. The uncle looked very tired. His eyes were still red. The teacher gave him an incense stick. Told him to pray in all 4 directions and then put it in the incense bowl. Everyone knelt around, clasped their hands and prayed repeatedly. The teacher shook his body, mumbled something I couldn't understand, but it seemed not to be going well because I saw sweat starting to appear on his forehead. After praying like that for a while, the teacher turned around and shook his head, telling the spirit not to come out to receive the offering. The teacher sat down to pray again, but this time, after reading a few sentences, suddenly Ms. Suyen jumped up, laughed loudly, and rushed to the offering table, throwing everything out into the yard. The whole family turned pale, and suddenly Teacher Ka shouted loudly, "You there, sit still." Sister Suyen seemed to not hear anything and was still angry and threw everything away. Suddenly, she turned around and rushed towards my family members who were standing. Looking at her, I wanted to lift my legs and run but couldn't. Everyone started to make a fuss. Then suddenly she fell down, growling. I felt like someone was pushing her down and she couldn't move. At this moment, Teacher Ka suddenly spoke up. "I told you to sit still but you didn't listen. Do you think no one here can control you?" It seems that the rumors that the sorcerers raise ghost soldiers are true. I saw Ms. Suyen lying on the ground wanting to struggle but couldn't. Her body was stiff as if something was pressing down on her. I thought it was the ghost soldiers that people had been gossiping about. Her mouth was still growling. Her eyes were bulging. Mr. Ka approached and asked, "Who are you? Where do you come from? Why are you haunting this house?" Then she started screaming, but I guarantee it wasn't her voice but that of some woman who sounded very strange. "That guy's mother let me go." She kept struggling, kicking her legs and screaming for him to let her go. I noticed Mr. Ka mumbling something and suddenly Ms. Suyen screamed in pain. Her face contorted, and she started begging Mr. Ka. He came closer and slowly said, "Tell me, where are you from? Why are you breaking into someone's house and causing trouble? I'm not joking with you." She started talking, let me call her grandma out of respect for the deceased, about her and my grandfather. That night after she took him home, she also packed all her belongings to go back to her hometown. When she got home, she cried a lot, because she still loved him, but the more she loved him, the more she hated him. After a few months at home, her belly started to get bigger. At that time she still didn't dare tell everyone in the house that she was pregnant because the feudal elders in the past were very conservative. They thought that a girl sleeping with a man to get a big belly was a disgrace to her family and relatives. And it wasn't like that in the past. I think it's still the same now. In any era, a girl's chastity must still be put first. She couldn't bear to abort that pregnancy, so she just kept it to herself and hid it. But the needle in the bag eventually came out. What had to happen happened. Her father found out. He beat and cursed his daughter terribly. He chased her out of the house with her 4-month pregnant belly. Her mother cried and begged but to no avail. So she closed her eyes and watched her daughter being chased out into the street. And that same night, she was so depressed that she jumped into the river and committed suicide. Then she followed her brother's friend up here. After telling the story, I saw her eyes were wet. Maybe she cried. Suddenly I also felt my eyes stinging. The fate of women in the past was so mean and cheap. It seemed like men only saw them as something to keep the house. Cook, do laundry. They never considered women as a real human being. And I have never hated my grandfather like this. Just because of his own cowardice he made so many people suffer. If that day he was determined to stand up to protect her. Who knows, maybe the two of them would have become husband and wife. I also hate her father. Just because of a little bit of false pride he let his daughter die in humiliation. I despise people like that. Turning around, I saw everyone sitting there with red eyes. Maybe now no one would be afraid of her anymore but they still hated her because she let the hatred of the previous generation be poured onto her children and grandchildren. Little Nok did not commit any crime. Teacher Ka's face was still cold as he continued to ask. Don't cry to make people feel sorry for you. What crime did that little girl commit that you have to put her down? Tell me the truth. What have you destroyed in this house? Now she burst out laughing again, speaking in a shrill, unpleasant voice. I wanted to let that dog's son go, but the father's spirit was too strong for me to get close to. Damn it, he's dead and still possesses the dog and wants to bite me. I'll kill him. Everyone shuddered. It turned out that day, Tu was possessed by my uncle to visit his wife and children. But everyone didn't know and chased him away. And that day, the sound of dogs barking that I heard was Tu and Lu fighting each other. I heard Tu screeching to get in the house but I was too scared to go out. She shouted again. Fuck you. Let me go. You're about to die and you're still doing things to help the living. Let me go. Mr. Ka quietly reached into the suitcase and pulled out 2 large pieces of paper with a huge bagua printed in the middle. He spread them out on the mat and muttered something. Then he shouted loudly, "You are causing trouble here while the saints do not know anything. That is good, but you have harmed people. So today I must take you to see the judge. Whether I live or die is my business. You do not have to care." After saying that, I saw him read something, waved his hand as if giving an order, then quickly grabbed the paper he had just pulled out, folded it, and put it in the suitcase. Ms. Suyen only had time to scream once before fainting. He told Mr. Kwong to go downstairs and pick up the baby so he could cut it. The baby cried loudly as soon as he saw him, but the whole night he slept with him. I didn't see him cry. He put him on the mat. Then he took a yellow piece of paper. I thought it was a charm, and stuck it straight to the baby's leg, then recited some strange sentences. After sticking it, the baby stopped crying, and opened his eyes wide and looked up at the sky. He told Mr. Kwong to keep the baby for a few more months and he would walk on his own. So there was nothing to be afraid of now. He turned to everyone and said, "Don't worry, this ghost has a strong resentment, so I will take it to the judge to be judged. Now everyone, please take all the offerings and burn them. I have also sent someone to catch the 2 dogs at the gate so you can go home now." Hesitating for a moment, he continued, "But I think your husband is so cruel." He sighed and packed all his things into his suitcase. Everyone invited him to stay for lunch, but he refused and insisted that Kwong take him home. My family saw that and didn't dare to keep him. He looked very tired because he was already old and still did things that displeased the dead. I heard that people who work as fortune tellers, exorcists, and ghost hunters will be scolded by the dead after death. Is that true? That night, I saw that everyone was gone. I was as scared as the previous days. My grandmother had also returned home, and Kwong was still looking at the boy with a wary gaze. But that night, I finally had a good night's sleep. After staying for a few more days, my mother and I returned home because my father kept calling me anxiously. After returning home for a while, the phone call from the countryside said that the boy who had been miscarried would also leave a few months later. But then Ms. Suyen got pregnant again soon after. Her belly was pointed so everyone thought it was a boy. When she gave birth everyone was relieved because there was no blue birthmark on the baby's leg. So Mr. Ka had cut the miscarried. I didn't expect him to be so good. It's been a long time since I heard anyone say anything about him. He must be very old now. Last Tet, I went to visit and saw Mr. Kwong's little boy. His name was Hung, already grown up, running and playing like a bandit. I think in life you reap what you sow. Sooner or later you will have to pay for the karma you caused. If you cannot pay, your children and grandchildren will have to suffer. There is no escape. Guys, please give yourself some faith. Guys.